the Blackburn Bucaneer was an example of British aircraft design at its best. Even today, it's still considered one of the finest low-level strike aircraft ever built. For 30 years, it served the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force with the greatest distinction. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union embarked on the most massive build-up of naval power the world had ever seen. The spearhead was the Sverdlov-class cruisers.
Now, the naval staff had to think of a way of counteracting this Sverdlov threat. Obviously, they couldn't go into a big building program of other surface vessels. They had to use the resources that they then had. These were largely aircraft carriers. And from them, they determined that they needed a new aircraft which would be capable of eliminating the Sverdlov-class vessel.
Captain FMA Torrance Spence, the deputy head of the Air Warfare Division of the Naval Staff, was the man tasked with devising the specification of such an aircraft. It had to be capable of flying at Mach 0.85 at 200 feet, carrying a nuclear weapon and other stores, and have a radius of action of 400 miles. The result was Requirement NA-39, issued in June 1952, and by February 1953, industry submissions began to land on the Ministry's desk. Hawkers submitted the P1108, powered by 4 engines, but most of the designs were to be powered by a pair of Avon or Sapphire engines. A big wing area would provide the lift that would be needed for flying on and off aircraft carriers. The successful design came from a company with historic links to the Royal Navy, Blackburn Aircraft. Blackburn had been supplying the Navy with aeroplanes for 40 years. Their portfolio had included the Dart and also the Skewer, which became the first aeroplane to shoot down an enemy aircraft in World War II. Later, they'd built their first machine for the RAF, the ungainly Beverley Heavy Transport. Robert Blackburn, who founded the company, was a contemporary of aviation greats like de Havilland and Handley Page. But he'd always shunned personal publicity, and that meant that he never received the recognition that he deserved. Brough in East Yorkshire was to be the home for the Buccaneer. The Blackburn B103, now called the NA-39 after the naval requirement, was a completely different project to anything Blackburn had done before. It was their first jet aircraft, and they had to learn new manufacturing techniques and systems. The machine tools they wanted were only made in America, and they would take more than 2 years to arrive, so Blackburn built their own. Time was tight. They were contracted to fly the NA-39 within 3 years. To fly fast and low in dense, turbulent air, the aircraft would need a tough airframe. A conventional airframe would wear out and break up in less than 150 hours in those conditions. This aircraft was to have a life of 3,000 hours. That meant that integral components had to be machined from solid steel and aluminium. But all that extra durability meant a loss of performance.
As the airplane was to be launched from an aircraft carrier, to some extent you could say that the takeoff problem was taken care of by the energy that the carrier could provide in the catapults. It was a catapult launch, of course. The problem was it was a big, heavy airplane, the biggest and heaviest the Royal Navy had had, and their carriers weren't all that big. Therefore, you had to effect a compromise between an airplane which was to fly in rough air very fast, and therefore wouldn't want a very big wing if it were to avoid fatigue problems attendant on the vibrations that were being transmitted to the structure, and the conflicting requirement of a large wing area, or a lot of lift to be more exact, that you required to land back on the carrier, or indeed come off the end of the carrier. what they did on the Buccaneer, and to an extent this had already been applied on such airplanes as the Scimitar, a previous naval airplane, and the American Lockheed F-104, was to blow air tapped off the engine over the landing flaps. This augmented the lift over these surfaces and therefore augmented the lift of the wing.
In March 1958, the prototype was covered in security shrouds and taken to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Bedford. At the beginning of April, the month in which they were contracted to fly the aircraft, everything looked good. The NA-39 did a number of fast taxi runs. That was normal before any first flight. But unfortunately, a tyre burst and it blew a hole in the wing skin. The team immediately set about mending it. On the very last day of the month, the 30th of April 1958, the Buccaneer took to the skies in the capable hands of test pilot Derek Whitehead and observer Bernard Watson. It climbed to 17,000 feet and the flight lasted for just 39 minutes. It was an unparalleled success, not only that, but it had all happened just 33 months after the contract had been issued. All of the targets were met. It was a record of which Blackburn was justifiably proud. After the excitement of the first flight, it was down to the long comparative tedium of flight trials. 20 development aircraft were built over the next 3 years. They flew all sorts of tests to develop not just the flight envelope, but also the avionics and the weapons systems. Brough was unsuitable for operating aircraft, so they did the trials at the nearby airfield at home on Spalding Moor. Meanwhile, NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia was working on the project under the US Mutual Weapons Development Program. As well as that, the United States contributed some $13 million worth of flight test instrumentation. The Buccaneer was to be the last British aircraft to benefit from US help in this way. Towards the end of flight testing, simulated carrier trials were carried out. In January 1960, they flew deck landing trials on HMS Victorious as she sailed in the English Channel in all sorts of weather conditions. Derek Whitehead made the first deck landing, and 30 takeoffs and landings were achieved over the next few days. Then they tried getting the aircraft from the hangar to the deck. The lift was very small. With the air brakes open and the nose folded, the aircraft squeezed through the hole with a bare 2 inches to spare.
The carrier qualification trials were a critical part of the development program, and this was very much a highly skilled operation on behalf of the pilot in particular. The catapult launch technique at that time had not been fully developed, and it involved rotation of the aircraft immediately following leaving the launch stroke, which was a critical maneuver at a critical part of the flight envelope, and at high weights where the acceleration rates were very, very low indeed. That lasted for quite a number of seconds before we got up to flying speed. Perhaps the most exciting bit of the recovery was if you missed the wire and had to bolt. The Buccaneer had fairly limited performance, and particularly on single engine it was fairly exciting to go around.
In July 1962, 801 Squadron Fleet Air Arm arrived at Lossiemouth to become the first operational Buccaneer squadron. After a work-up period, they left for HMS Ark Royal in February 1963.
I've been flying Scimitars mostly before the Buccaneer. Very fast aircraft, very overpowered. So the Buccaneer Mark I was a bit of a shock in some ways. It was very underpowered, particularly on the one engine. On the other hand, it was a lovely aircraft to fly, and particularly good in the landing circuit, which of course is very important for a naval aircraft. Landing aboard a carrier in a fixed-wing aircraft is really very different to landing on a runway. You have got to be bang on for speed. If you're too fast, you run the danger of pulling the wire out. If you're too slow, you run the danger of having too much attitude on the aircraft, and the hook may actually foul the stern of the carrier before you get to the wires. There's only a few feet safety clearance. The other thing, of course, is you've got to be accurately lined up with the centre line. If you're not, you could go over the side in one direction, or you could hit the deck park and the island of the carrier in the other. So it does take a rather a lot more concentration than landing at an airfield.
The original engine, the Jaran Junior, was lacking in thrust. Its low power threatened the operational career of the Buccaneer. But Rolls-Royce had been developing a new engine which would provide the extra thrust that the Navy needed. These new Spey engines were installed, creating the Buccaneer Mark II. Each Spey developed a little over 11,000 pounds of static thrust, increasing the range by 600 miles and doubling the weapons load to 16,000 pounds. The Buccaneer was now a truly effective long-range strike weapons system. In the event of war, the Buccaneers would be used to eliminate the Soviet Sverdlov threat.
Now, the Sverdlov was obviously well defended and obviously had radar. The attacker must therefore get close to it undetected and preferably survive. The weapon that was then becoming available, were smaller than the Hiroshima type atomic bombs, about 20 kilotons. The Buccaneer was to carry one of these, and the attack had to be made under the radar, and this was then specified as a low-level attack over 100 nautical miles at 0.85 of the speed of sound, which is about 550 knots, about 650 miles an hour. This high speed enabled the atomic bomb to be effectively thrown at the Sverdlov from about 3 miles away. It could also carry 4 conventional iron bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, 2 by 2. However, we did encounter problems during development with these bombs because they started life close together, a matter of inches apart in the bomb bay. And with at high speeds, even the low disturbances that we had in this bomb bay were sufficient to make them bang together when they came out. At first sight, this seemed to be very disturbing, to have bombs banging together within a few feet of your aircraft. But in the end, after trying a number of aerodynamic fixes to get the airflow right in the bomb bay, we eliminated the problem by the simple experience of angling out the guns which fired out the bombs, and we never had the problem thereafter.
As well as the bombs, the Buccaneer could carry plenty of other underwing stores. For instance, SNEB rockets, guided missiles, and the Martel air-to-surface precision tactical missile. But it had no way of defending itself.
In the early days, the Buccaneer was very vulnerable. We felt very naked. We had no defensive capability against a fighter. And if an enemy fighter came up and spotted you, there's nothing you could do except ask it to go away. So when we were going through the Suez Canal in HMS Victorious, I was senior pilot of the Buccaneer Squadron 801. And I thought it would be nice if we could build a dummy Sidewinder and stick it underneath the Buccaneer. So we got a whole lot of empty beer cans and welded them together, painted them white, added some fins made of cardboard, stuck it underneath the Buccaneer. The purpose of this, of course, was to get the intelligence photographers of the other side, who were no doubt hiding behind a palm tree, to get pictures of the Buccaneer and to gain the impression that we did have some defensive capability. And it worked, as far as I know. Certainly, the missile stayed on the Buccaneer until halfway through the canal, when Commander Eyre went to lunch, and on his way to lunch he spotted this thing, which was against all the rules and regulations, and had it removed. But I like to think that the other side got the impression that the Buccaneer had now got some self-defense capability.
On the 18th of March 1967, the supertanker Torrey Canyon ran aground 16 miles off Land's End. It was carrying 118,000 tons of crude oil. The Buccaneer had not been used in anger so far, but it was now involved in Operation Sink Ship. The irony was that that gave it credit for sinking a bigger tonnage of shipping than any other aircraft had achieved before.
The problem with the Torrey Canyon was to ignite the crude oil, and crude oil needs something like a 1,000-pound bomb to burn it. It needs a weapon with a very high explosive temperature. So Buccaneers were the obvious answer, and that's what was used.
From the early days, people had hoped that the Buccaneer would be an export success. Both the US Navy and the West German Kriegsmarine squadrons had been thought of as possible markets. In the event, only South Africa bought the aircraft, because they had a low-level strike requirement identical to the Royal Navy's. The South African Buccaneers were similar to the Royal Navy's, except that they had Raytog retractable rockets to improve the takeoff performance in the hot, humid climate. In 1965, TSR-2 was cancelled, but then it was suggested that the Buccaneer might fulfill the RAF's requirements. After 3 years of considering American aircraft, the Ministry of Defense announced an order for the RAF Buccaneer. The Air Force received 43 new aircraft, as well as 62 ex-Royal Navy Mark IIs. Extra fuel tanks increased the RAF Buccaneer's range so that they could fight in all the relevant areas of the North Sea and the Mediterranean. For more than 20 years, Buccaneers gave sterling service to the RAF. But as a maritime strike aircraft, it only managed to show its worth during exercises with the Navy. Near the end of its service life, the Buccaneer was still proving that it could make the grade. In their last Buccaneer Overseas Detachment, 208 Squadron have arrived for exercises at Gibraltar. Their presence is closely connected with a Type 42 destroyer, HMS Liverpool. Aboard her are 6 student principal warfare officers. They'll be tested to the limit at the climax of their 1-year course. They've come to experience live firings of the vessel's 4.5-inch guns and its phalanx and 20mm close-range weapons. Each officer will have to defend the ship against inbound missiles simulated by the Buccaneers. Failure could mean the end of their careers. The Buccaneer crews put their attack plans together.
first one was a Seagull attack, so we launched from quite a reasonably long range, well outside their radar. Their missile system will usually go out about half the range that we fire the Seagull from, so we'd be very safe doing that. But once we've done that, we then fly the profile of the missile, because otherwise we'd just turn away and they'd never see anything. So we then go up to 540 knots at 100 feet and fly in as the missile would, and then at the missile the radar would pop up and start looking. We actually climb up, put the radar on, remark the ship, and then go back down to 100 feet and find out. The second one, we then went back out to 40 miles, and the second one we did was what we call a Delta, which is an LGB attack. We didn't normally do it in a four-ship with the two aircraft behind with a laser designating pod, but on this one, because we just had the two, we just simulated the two bombers at the front.
Some of the aircrew in Gibraltar took part in the Gulf War. After 20 years in service, the RAF Buccaneers went into real action for the first time.
Granby was the first time the Buccaneer had been used in wartime, and it was strange that it was used in a manner that was completely different from that it was designed for. Of course, it was designed for low-level maritime strike, obviously over the sea, and we employed it in the high-level target designation over land, which is distinctly different. But again, great testimony to the airframe. It performed magnificently well. It handled well at height, and we managed to, through subtle tactics, get the pilot's eyes onto the target. Of course, the problem being that if you can't see the target, we couldn't bomb it. So the pilot was responsible primarily for sussing out the target, for talking the navigator onto it, and if necessary, for diving towards the target. And then once the navigator had seen the target through his pavespike screen, he could then take control of the pavespike head. The pilot would then return to altitude, and we would illuminate the target with laser energy. The tornadoes would then drop onto whatever we were bombing. We also designated for ourselves in the latter stages of the war, we could carry 2 paveway bombs in addition to the pavespike pod, and also self-defense if necessary of a Sidewinder air-to-air missile. Typically, however, we would always fly in a package with the tornadoes. So we would go in, we would then spike for the tornadoes, and then we would remain overhead the target to drop our bombs, designating for ourselves from a dive. So we'd tip in from as high as we could go. Then at the time we would then pickle the bombs off. The navigator would then call he was happy, and the pilot would recover, get back up to altitude, and he would then be free to maneuver the aircraft, keep his eyes open for ground launch SAMs, and the navigator would then illuminate the target with laser energy, and hopefully the bombs would hit. So we did a certain amount of that near the latter stages of the war.
Proven in both war and peace, the Buccaneer had become an essential element of Britain's maritime defence. But after 30 years' service, it was time for them to stand down and let the newer generation of multi-role aircraft take over. For air crews, Buccaneer had been the last seat of the pants aircraft. For the nation, Buccaneer was the last completely British bomber.